Stephen Bourne, thank you for talking to us.
You're welcome.
Can you tell us about your favourite book?
If I have to have a favourite book, or even better, if I'm ever invited onto Desert Island Discs on Radio 4, which is one of my ambitions, and they say to me, what book would you take to your desert island? It would be this one, Harry Daley, This Small Cloud. When I first read it back in the 1980s, I just found it tremendously moving, beautifully written, very natural kind of storytelling. And it's very simply the autobiography of a working class man who was born in Lowestoft in 1901, partly raised in Dorking in Surrey, which is a bit closer to London. And it was his ambition to come to London. And he would, when he was younger, come up to London to see the lights, to go to the theatre, to go to art galleries. He was a self-made man. He was self-taught, self-cultured, if there's such a term. But in order to stay in London, he had to work in London. So he joined the Metropolitan Police. And in the book, he talks freely about his childhood, his time in the Metropolitan Police, which he served as a police officer from 1925 to 1950. But it's just such a beautifully written and heartfelt book. You can't help but be moved by it.
What makes his life so extraordinary?
He was an extraordinary man who did extraordinary things, although on the surface you probably wouldn't think being a policeman in London in the 1920s and 30s and 40s would have been extraordinary. But what's missing from the book, unfortunately, is his friendship with the Bloomsbury Group, writers, artists, intellectuals, literary set in the 1930s. Duncan Grant, there you are, Duncan Grant, the gay artist, portrait painter, painted a portrait of him. What happened was, the way the story goes, is that JR Ackerley lived in Hammersmith. He was a playwright. He had a play on at the Lyric Hammersmith, and Harry was walking his Hammersmith beat in 1925, 1926. And the story goes that JR Ackerley, who was homosexual, came out to collect his pint of milk off the doorstep and returned with the milk and Harry in uniform, and they became great friends. Not lovers, but great friends. But JR Ackerley introduced Harry to the novelist EM Forster, who became Harry's lover. And they were lovers for several years, but Harry was a policeman who was very indiscreet. So he was upholding the law in his public life while breaking the law in his private life. He liked a bit of rough trade, what we would now call rough trade, and he was indiscreet in the times when homosexuality was a criminal offence. So although he misses out of his autobiography this crucial part of his life, his friendship with the Bloomsbury Group, his affair with EM Forster, one of the most famous English novelists of his time, Passage to India, Where Angels Fear to Tread, all those great novels. He misses these people out of the book because he fell out with Forster and he fell out with them. And he had he admits one of his bad traits was that he could be very bitter if you slighted him. But that's very true of working class people who are made to feel uncomfortable by so-called friends. If a so-called friend slights you or makes you feel uncomfortable, you cut them out of your life. I'm like that. So I related to Harry in many ways as a working class person myself who wanted to write books, not become cultured. I tried reading a Jane Austen novel once and threw it down. I couldn't get on with it. Couldn't even get past chapter 1. So I wasn't that fussed about becoming cultured. but I wanted to move into a world that unfortunately is dominated by middle class people. I say unfortunately because they can hold you back a lot when you're working class and you identify as such. So I understood Harry from that point of view, and he does talk about a lot of that in the book as well. But what's also interesting about Harry is that he broadcast for the BBC. Now, in those days, the Metropolitan Police would never have allowed a policeman to broadcast, but they gave him permission. And the reason that came about was in 1928, JR Ackerley again became talks producer at the BBC. BBC Radio, this is the old wireless. This is before television. And he asked Harry to come into the BBC studio at Broadcasting House to broadcast occasionally about his life as a policeman, fishing boats in Lowestoft, which he remembered from his childhood, and all sorts of things. And I found what the BBC didn't keep were recordings of these talks, but they kept the scripts. So I have the scripts of almost all of his radio appearances. You can access them from the BBC.
Did you find them quite fascinating?
Absolutely.
Now, you mention in the book he doesn't really talk about his sexuality, but as a historian and somebody who admires Harry Daley, do you know if he was out at work in the police?
He does talk about his sexuality. That's what made the book, when I first read it, so, wow, he talks about his sexuality. He was quite open about it from teenage years.
Did it affect his career in any way?
No, you see, this is the thing. When I gave my talk on Harry Daley to the Metropolitan Police LGBT network last year, they were astounded that a gay officer could be that open. He didn't care what they thought of him. He was a likeable person. He was popular. And I think in those days, in certain circles, you put yourself at risk, of course. And sometimes gay men did end up in prison or ostracised. But in certain circles, you could get away with it. Now, there were officers that he worked with that were nasty to him or horrible to him. But they never arrested him. They never, vilified him because he was popular with lots of others. And a police officer once said to me, Stephen, in those days, because this was a police officer I knew who was retired, and he had joined the Metropolitan Police in 1953, just a few years after Harry had retired from the Met. And he said, when you've got a group of men together, some you like, some you hate, some you put up with, some, will cook for you, some will turn their backs on you. He said you're a whole, and in police section houses, which is where Harry lived for his entire police career. He never had a home. He lived in section houses in the different boroughs in London that he worked. Hammersmith, he worked at Vine Street Police Station in Westminster, then he went to Wandsworth. Always lived in section houses, and he was always popular man. He loved classical music. Apparently he owned thousands of old 78 records, mostly classical music or opera, and he would have an old gramophone in his section house. I don't know if you know what section houses were like, but they were literally cubicles with a bed, a wardrobe, perhaps a cupboard by your bedside, and you shared this almost dormitory-like. I mean, you were sectioned off with a kind of, not a war, a sort of petition. But he would play his classical music. If you didn't like it, you walked out, went for a walk, or went to the games room and played billiards or had a game of darts. If you were police officers off duty, and he would play his music, and other officers would sit around and listen.
He was very cultured.
He was very cultured.
What do you admire most about PC Harry Daley?
That he was able to survive as open as he was able to be, as a gay man in a profession that you wouldn't have expected it to be, the Metropolitan Police. And I admire him not just for being gay policeman. I admire him for his total honesty in his book about all kinds of things that happened to him and what he observed in life. It's not just about being gay and being a policeman, it's about a whole much broader thing. And you don't get that. I think sometimes when you read the autobiographies of some middle class people, for example, they're very pretentious, they're very up themselves. Harry isn't like that. He's very down to earth, very direct, I'd love to have met him. I really would. And I'm so proud of something that I did for him, which was when the Tate Britain did their Queer Britain exhibition the year before last, I think it was. They didn't know about the Duncan Grant portrait, which I'd found hanging in the Tate Gallery in London. And I told them, I said, you've got to have that. Policeman? Yeah. Painted by Duncan Grant, one of the most famous gay portrait painters of his time. And they went and had a look at it and said, yeah, we've got to have it. And they had it in the gallery. The sad thing was I wasn't allowed to take a photograph of it. But I do have a little copy of it up there on the wall.
I saw the painting as well.
Did you?
Yes,
in the Queer
wonderful
Britain?
painting. Yes,
that
I was there.
Because of me. And of course they forgot to invite me to the opening.
Of course.
So they apologised profusely and sent me the book they published, a free copy.
Now, you've told us how much you admire him. Is there anything you dislike about him?
I don't know. There's nothing about him that I dislike, but like many other people that have read the book, I'm disappointed that he did allow his... Maybe it was his bitterness towards EM Forster and the Bloomsbury set that resulted in him leaving them out of the book. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe I'm making that, assuming that. Maybe he just felt that because they were still alive when he wrote the book, he didn't want to upset them, but he could have asked their permission to put them into the book. So I'm disappointed about that, but to be fair to Harry, he couldn't get it published. He died in 1971. Even his brother said the book isn't worth publishing. And it wasn't until 1986, 15 years after he died, that the book was finally published, which is when I discovered it. And that was because of connections he had to the Bloomsbury Group, people that were connected to them that said, we've got to read this manuscript. And it's all in the archive in Surrey, Dorking in Surrey, that the original manuscript, handwritten, he didn't type it, he hand wrote it. One of his neighbours typed it up for the publisher, but Harry's original is in handwriting. It's
been out of print for many years. It's very hard to find, and when you can, you might find it on eBay or somewhere. Very expensive. Yeah. Why do you think it should be republished?
I want to be involved in this book being republished. I'd love to contribute to it, like an introduction, but I don't know yet whether the publisher would agree to it, who owns the rights. I did try English Heritage Blue Plaque, and I got endorsed by the LGBT Metropolitan Police Network, but they turned it down. So I'm trying to get recognition for Harry, very difficult. English Heritage, I think, should have given him a blue plaque, and they didn't. So be it. Sometimes they make good decisions, sometimes they make bad decisions. But I've now reached a point where I want to approach the publisher and see where the land lies, to see if it's feasible to get this book in print again.
Do you think there are any valuable lessons we can learn from his life, or indeed from his book, This Small Cloud?
Absolutely, and it's to be honest, to be true to yourself. It's all about being true to yourself and to being honest, and to not allow people in your life to inhibit you or put you down or criticise you in such a way that you feel upset. I mean, I just think the way he forged his path in life is very inspiring.
And you mentioned, this is the final question, that you would have loved to have met him. If you could have met him, is there anything you'd like to say to him or ask him?
Oh, that's a question out of the blue. I don't know, because we might not hit it off. We might rub each other up the wrong way. Or we might rub each other up the right way. You just don't know which way it's going to turn. So I can't answer that, because without knowing him, really, I only know him through his book, and I think I know him as best as we're ever going to know him through his autobiography. I just think we'd have a lot in common, and we'd probably share a lot of common ground, although maybe our interests are different. I mean, I'm not remotely interested in classical music or opera singers. But you never know. I think he probably would have been a kind of mentor, or someone who would have educated me about things I don't know about. And that's what life should be about. That's what friendship would be about. But I suspect we probably would have got on okay.
Well, hopefully at some point this small cloud will be republished and you'll be involved. Stephen Bourne, thanks so much.
Thank you.